Good evening, Scar Island fans. Here we are at the finale of our wonderful book, Scar Island, by Dan Gemeinhart. I'm mentioning the author's name because he has written another book, and if you like this, sometimes reading another book by the author, which I know someone closely has done of another series, you might want to read the other book. The other book he's written, they mention it somewhere. Oh, I thought I seen it somewhere. But anyway, you can look it up. Dan Gemeinhart with a G. Gemeinhart. Author of, there it is, The Honest Truth. So he wrote The Honest Truth first, I guess, and then this. Is it where we just determine that? This is his acclaimed author, Dan Gemeinhart, most gripping novel. I thought I read somewhere that this was his debut. Maybe we figured that out. But anyway, we're not going to dilly-dally with that. We already discussed that early on. So anyway, last week we read count them, 3 chapters. Chapter 26 was Going Alone, where he decided to go and Jonathan decided to go and save Colin. Chapter 27, even though it meant possibly dying and everyone wished him luck. Chapter 27, Darkness and Drowning, where everything, you name it, happened. Down, down, down he goes to find Colin, finds him, and then what happens next, we won't tell you because you got to listen to that whole thing to know. Chapter 28, we're going to have to tell you the title of because it gives it away. Ends with them at the library. And the librarian meets him at the door and says, "Please, come in. We can find you another book." And we will have to find another book when we finish this one, because good books make you want another one. And so I've got a couple in mind that I'm hoping to read next. And hope you'll join me for those, because I've enjoyed doing this, and I hope you've enjoyed it too when you want to listen again. It's fun. You can, when you listen to them, you can even listen to them if you're in the car without the video and just hear my voice, which you could do too. Anyway, chapter 29 is called A Lunatic, in parentheses, not an idiot. The library was always so neat and dry and dustless, was in a shambles. The storm had shattered the windows here, too. Rain and wind howled and blustered inside, soaking the books and ripping out pages and leaving puddles on the floor and bookshelves. "We've got to go," Jonathan blurted out, taking a step inside, "and you've got to come with us." "Oh," the librarian answered calmly, turning and walking slowly into his wrecked library. "I don't think so. What kind of book would you like?" "No, really, we've all got to go. This is a hurricane. The whole place is flooded. This island's going under." The librarian stopped. He turned and looked at Jonathan in his hunched, twisted way. A small smile rose just barely to his lips. "Yes," he replied, "I know. It's the sea, come at last to claim her own." "Then come on. We've got to get out, tie our ground." The librarian chuckled. "Yes," he said, "you do. The sea is coming." He reached up and stroked 99's dripping fur. "But I'm staying." "You'll die," Jonathan insisted. The librarian shrugged. "I have lived long enough. I have never left this island. Where else would I go?" Jonathan shook his head and stammered, "No, but... The librarian turned and looked out at the storm through those narrow, shattered windows. "You must take the other boys higher, to the only part of Slabhenge that will last." "What? Where is that?" "The old lighthouse. Up, 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 above the Admiral's room." The lighthouse was there. First, before the asylum, before the school. It is built on the original stone, the true stone of the island. The rest, the librarian spread his arms to include the windswept stone structure, the rest is built on sand, but the lighthouse will stand. Come on, Jonathan, Colin whispered behind him. We've got to go. Jonathan cocked his head. There was something the librarian had said that stuck in his mind. You must take the other boys. You know, he said, looking the librarian in the eyes, you know about the Admiral, about the grown-ups. The man's smile grew just a bit. I'm a lunatic, not an idiot. I go at night to the kitchen. It's been terribly messy. The librarian paused, working his fingers into 99's fur. 99 closed his eyes and leaned into the scratching fingers. And ice cream is my favorite food. It's kept in the freezer, of course. We didn't kill them. It was lightning. They were all outside standing in a puddle. The Admiral had his sword in the air. The librarian said thoughtfully. The Admiral was a madman, standing around in a puddle holding a metal sword in the air during a lightning storm. He pursed his lips and shrugged. Sounds about right for him. The librarian nodded, then looked to the nearest shelf. Now you must go. Quickly. So we need to choose a book. No, I can't really take one. We have to swim to get back. I'll get wet. Oh, it'll get wet. Excuse me, they're going to get wet, not wet. It'll get wet. The librarian clucked his tongue, his eyes still on the book spines. All of these books will be at the bottom of the sea very soon, and you cannot leave a library without a book. Ah, here, this one. The old man pulled a book from the shelf. It was thick and bound in soft black leather. Moby Dick. The story of a madman lost at sea. He dies in a storm. The hero is the only one who lives. The librarian handed the book to Jonathan and squinted up sideways at him. I don't think that is what will happen here. No, you will save them, Jonathan. Now go to the lighthouse. Jonathan breathed quickly through his nose. Are you sure? Oh, yes, go. Jonathan looked into the librarian's eyes. Thank you. Jonathan turned to go. Wait, there is one thing you could do for me. What? The librarian reached up and plucked the enormous rat from his shoulder. He pressed his lips for a long moment into the rodent's neck, then held him out with two hands toward Jonathan. Take 99 with you. You could save him, like the others. Jonathan gulped. The rat looked at him with curious, shiny eyes. He didn't hiss or snarl. Jonathan handed Moby Dick to Colin and reached out reluctantly to take the offered animal. That's reluctantly. I'm not sure if I really want to take that animal. 99 was surprisingly soft and predictably heavy. The rat sniffed for a second at Jonathan's hands, then scrambled gently up onto perch on his shoulder. The librarian watched. His eyes were wet and glowing. Yes, he said, you can save him, and maybe, when you're home, find him a wife. Jonathan nodded. Sure, a nice big wife. Yes, that's right. Now go. Off you go. Take a candle. I won't be needing them. Colin grabbed a candle from atop the closest bookshelf, and the two boys ran out into the corridor. Jonathan looked back once to see the librarian standing in the doorway with the door wide open. He was lit from behind by a few flickering candles. His hair whipped about by the wind. Rats were swarming through the open door by his feet, seeking the light and relative dryness of the library. Several of them had no tails. This old man made no move to stop them. He wouldn't die alone. Jonathan followed the light of Colin's candle through the hallways. The water was above their ankles. They arrived panting at the stairs that led down past the hatch. The water was much higher now than it had been when Jonathan came before. It was rising and falling and swirling, lapping at the very top step. It would be longer swim this time, and now he had a rat. What do we do? We swim, Colin. That's how I got through. Just a quick dip down and then up again. No big deal. What about the candle? Don't worry about it. There's a lit lantern on the other side. Just take a deep breath. Jonathan handed 99 over before Colin could think to push it away. He dropped Moby Dick with a splash at his feet. I can't believe I'm doing this, Jonathan said. He tucked his shirt into his pants tightly, and then unbuttoned the top 2 buttons, taking the rat back from Colin. He slid him into the shirt against his bare skin. He rebuttoned the shirt. The rat scratched and writhed against his body, squeaking and squirming. Come on, before he chews through my stomach! Without thinking, Jonathan dove head first, pushing off the first step as hard as he could to rocket himself through the water. As soon as the cold water hit them, 99 went crazy. He tore and fought and twisted. Jonathan gritted his teeth and swam as hard as he could, pawing and kicking at the black water. He didn't slow down when an upswelling of water pressed him against the ceiling. He didn't slow when the rat's teeth sank into his skin. He didn't slow when he saw the salty murk, the glow of lantern lighting up ahead. He didn't slow until his feet found the flat stairs and his head broke into air and he stepped out of the water. He climbed a few steps up. 99 was shaking and coughing inside his shirt. He struggled weakly against the wet fabric. Jonathan unbuttoned his shirt and pulled the bedraggled rat out. 99 coughed up some water and then slowly crawled back up to Jonathan's shoulder, his body shaking. Jonathan gave him a reassuring scratch. Colin's head popped up into the stairwell, gasping for air. Jonathan helped him up the slippery stairs, pulling the lantern from the hook. They stood panting, eyes on the dark water they'd emerged from. Well, Colin gasped, that was so... His words were cut off by a wrenching, grating crack from below the water's surface. A great rush of huge bubbles rose to the surface, and with a sickening whoosh, the water began to rise more quickly, so quickly they could see it climbing and racing up the stairs in a rapid, steady surge. What happened? Colin cried, stumbling backward up the stairs. I don't know. I think something else just broke open. We gotta go. The water rose up the stairs faster than they could climb, nearly overtaking them before they reached the top. By the time they broke out into the hallway, the water was a surging wave that came nearly to their waists. Together they ran through the familiar hallways they both knew, winding back and toward the dining room. The dark wall of water gurgled just behind them, slurping at the walls and sloshing around the corners. 99 clung to Jonathan's shoulders with a firm grip of his claws. His tail slapped on Jonathan's back as they ran. They burst into the dining room just ahead of the wave. They almost ran into Sebastian and the rest of the boys. They were all crowded around the door, holding lanterns and candles. Sebastian was at the front, his sword out in front of him and a coil of rope thrown over his shoulder, a dark look on his face. Well, that's the end of 29. Well, I thought we'll finish it up. It seems like it's a lot for the next chapter, but what do you think? I could wait. What do you think? Should I wait or should I read? Should I wait or should I read now? This is a song. Should I stay or should I go now? So it's on 235 to, let's see how many pages it is. 235 to 249. Can you do the math? I think that's 15 pages, something like that. 35, 45, yeah. Well, let's finish it, huh? Might as well. Chapter 30. I won't tell you the name of that chapter either, but you can guess probably. It has 4 letters. The wave of water was slowed when it hit the narrow doorway. It crested and poured into the dining room, a frothy white head of bubbles at its top. Colin and Jonathan braced themselves as it hit their backs. Some of the boys who weren't ready were knocked off their feet and sent tumbling head over heels in the water. The water pouring in from the doorway leveled as the water in the room rose until it all stood flat above their knees, and still slowly rising. The boys regathered themselves, coughing and rubbing the water out of their eyes. Sebastian had never lost his footing. He still stood with his sword, eyes on Jonathan. We were just about to leave, he said. Where were you guys going? Sebastian looked him in the eye. We were coming to find you. Really? Sebastian shrugged and nodded. Yeah. Oh, thanks. Sebastian shrugged again, then squinted and looked closer at Jonathan. Jesus, what is that thing on your shoulder? It's a rat. Don't worry about it. We gotta go, quick, or we're all gonna die. Go where? To the lighthouse. What lighthouse? I'll explain as we go. We've got to move. Jonathan started to brush past him, but Sebastian put a hand out and stopped him forcefully. Easy, Johnny. I didn't want to get blamed for you dying. Doesn't mean I want you in charge. We decided to stay here where it's safe. It isn't safe here, Sebastian. This whole place is going under. The water's rising and the island is sinking. We've got to go up. Up. Up? It's safer down here, Sebastian insisted. What if the tower blows over? Gerald asked. What if lightning hits it? Francis demanded. Going up is our only choice, Jonathan insisted. It's the only way to save ourselves. You can't trust him. Benny's voice was ugly and hissing. You know what he's here for. Lightning flashed through the windows. The wind was a roar, swirling around them. Jonathan saw the boys' faces harden at Benny's words, saw the doubt flickering in their eyes. You're wrong, Benny, Jonathan said, his voice rising with the pounding of his heart and the raging of the storm. You can't trust me? My sister, she did die in a fire, but Jonathan stopped, his voice choked by tears. But you didn't start it, Jonathan finished it, did you? Stop it, Colin, Jonathan said, but Colin didn't stop. You told me, Jonathan, you told me she took your matches. Jonathan swallowed, took a choking breath. He looked into Colin's face. Colin's eyes widened. Oh, he breathed. It was her, wasn't it? Your sister started the fire. Shut up, Colin. And you took the blame. You let them think it was you because it's my fault. Jonathan interrupted, shouting, They were my matches. She learned from me. Jonathan's voice broke off, his shoulders shaking with sobs. 99's claws dug in harder to stay on. Jonathan closed his eyes against his tears and lowered his head. It's my fault. He heard through the storm and his own sadness the sound of someone splashing toward him. Two hands, gentle as birds, came to rest on his arm. They worked at the buttons of his sleeves, then pulled the fabric up his elbows. Jonathan didn't fight. How did you get the scars? Jonathan asked. Jonathan didn't answer. How did you get the scars? Jonathan asked him again. Then in a whisper, so low only Jonathan could hear it, he added, Tell them, Jonathan. If you tell them, they'll believe you. They'll follow you. You can save them. Jonathan took one breath, then two. He opened his eyes. He lifted his head. I didn't start the fire, he said. The words came out scratchy and faint. He cleared his throat and started again. I'm going to have a drink. I get a scratchy throat like Jonathan. Oh, you have company tonight? Just, Callie, I almost called you. Want to come? Come up for the last chapter? No, she's going to lay on the floor. Contrary. Cats are contrary sometimes. Anyway. I didn't start the fire. I woke up. There she is. She come to listen to the last chapter. Come show your face. Say hello. Hello. I didn't start the fire. I woke up and I heard her screaming, and I ran downstairs. I'm sorry. I ran downstairs, but the fire was too big, too hot. I couldn't get to her. I tried so hard. He held up his arms. The scar tissue, twisted and tough, flashed whitely in the lightning. I tried until the firefighters got there and dragged me away. I did everything I could to save her. He realized he was shouting as much as to himself as to the watching boys. I did everything I could. Tears joined the seawater on his face, warm tears, clean and true. Walter walked up to him and put a hand on his shoulder. It's okay, man. It's okay. Jonathan took a long, steadying breath. He nodded a thank you to Walter and to Colin. Then he looked up at all the other boys. The scars. We've got to get to the only part of this place that's built on rock. The only part that isn't going to wash away. We've got to get to the old lighthouse. His words hung like a tattered flag in the windswept room. His words hung like a tattered flag in the wind-swept room. Interesting. Like a tattered flag, his words. He's telling the truth, a deep voice interjected. They all turned and looked to where Patrick sat, still tied in his chair, but now atop one of the dining room tables. About the lighthouse. They did used to be one, going way back now. So the old sailing days. It's built on the stones indeed. Jonathan looked at Sebastian. We need to go, Sebastian. Sebastian's jaw was clenched. His chest was heaving with shallow breaths. He looked down to the water around his thighs, then up at Patrick. What about your boat? He asked. Patrick shook his head. No way. Too late for that. I barely made it out here, and the storm's only gotten stronger. Sebastian bit at his lip. His eyes cut to Jonathan. He nodded. Jonathan blew out a deep breath. He nodded back. Then he turned to Roger and Gregory. Cut him loose, he said, and all of you follow me. Without waiting for an answer, Jonathan waded through the waist-deep water past Sebastian, past the waiting boys, toward the staircase that led up toward Sebastian's room, the admiral's office, the lighthouse. Colin followed him. 99 clung to Jonathan's shoulder. What a picture. Did you see it? Colin followed Jonathan, 99 on his shoulder. When he got to the stairwell, he stopped and turned. The boys were filing after him, all of them. They looked lost and frightened in the raging wind and the flashbulb lightning. They were drenched and exhausted and terrified. They needed to be saved. Sebastian was up on the table, sawing at Patrick's ropes with his sword. He didn't look terrifying. He looked like a confused kid, finding his way through the dark. Jonathan felt something bump him and looked down. It was a piece of the ruined sinner's sorrow, bobbing in the water. Several more pieces floated around him. He picked up a piece. Everyone grab a piece, he said. We're going to need the wood. The storm was like a beast hammering its slab hedge. Even running up the stone stairwell, they could hear it outside, through the walls, howling to be let in. Jonathan ran past the doors to the grown-ups' rooms, past the locked door to the admiral's office, to the far, dark end of the hall. The end of the hall was a curved wall crumbling with age. It was made of a different stone than the rest of Slabhenge, bigger blocks of grayer rock that looked even older than the rock Jonathan had grown used to being surrounded by. In the curved wall of ancient stone was a door made of tremendously thick slats of dark wood, bound together with rusty iron. The door looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Instead of a knob, it simply had a metal latch, like a pirate's treasure chest, that connected to a bolt on the stone wall. Jonathan yanked on the latch, and it opened with a protesting creak of rusty metal that had been wet and unused for too long. He pushed on the door, and it swung slowly open. Beyond the door was a round stairwell, leading up in one direction and down in another. Its walls and stairs were made of the same gray rock. The air smelled stale, dusty, forgotten. It was even colder in the stairwell than it was in the rest of the school. The boys piled up behind Jonathan. Up, he said. We've got to go up. They raced up the stairs, taking them two at a time. Round and round the stairwell spiraled, up and up through the dank darkness, with all the dark world raging outside the walls. Jonathan reached the top breathless. Colin was behind him, then the rest. Sebastian was the last, behind Patrick. The top of the tower was a round room. On all sides were windows, sturdy, double-paned glass, crisscrossed by metal bars. The lightning filled the sky all around them. They were surrounded by the storm, teetering in the angry heavens. On all sides were windows in the black clouds, and whipping wind and sideways rain. In the middle of the room, on a raised stone landing, was a great black iron bowl, big enough for Jonathan to have stretched out and lain down in. A massive curved mirror stood in the far side of the bowl, mounted on a mechanism of gears and bars and wheels that circled the bowl. To Jonathan's right was a large metal handle. The lighthouse, Jonathan whispered. Just like he said. The boys stood in silence, looking out the windows at the hurricane that raged all around them, inches away. It was almost deafening. They could see all of Slabhenge when the lightning flashed. The courtyard flooded now, halfway up the windows into the dining room. The boat still rocked between the walls. They could see the roof that covered the rest of the school, rising and falling with the confusing ramblings of the maze-like building. They could see the other towers poking stubbornly up into the black skies. The other towers poking stubbornly up into the black skies. "Look!" Miguel shouted over the storm. "Look at the towers!" They all crowded to the windows. "What? What about them? There's only 3. One's missing." They all looked and saw it then. The far tower was gone, simply gone. They could see where the stone walls led to the space that it could occupy, but the walls stopped in a jagged, saw-tooth break. A loose pile of stones was all that remained of the tower, avalanching down into the white-capped sea. Jonathan looked at Colin. Colin was staring at the pile of rubble with wide eyes. It was Colin's tower. The tower with his mattress and his papers and his 3 lonely candlesticks. Somewhere among those waves bobbed dozens of white paper cranes and a few shiny gold chocolate wrappers. "There! Look at the gate!" They all spun back to the courtyard with its ghostly boat. The far side, where the watery stairs and the gate through which they had all entered Slabhenge was crumbling before their eyes. The arch above the gate crashed into the water with a massive splash. The gigantic waves poured relentlessly through the gap, pushing and pulling at the 100-year-old walls. They fell apart, stone block by stone block, as the water coursed through. Soon the whole wall was gone, a heaped mound of stones just below the water's surface. The courtyard was left with walls on only 3 sides. With the one wall gone, the waves rushed unhindered into the courtyard, rising above the level of the dining room windows. It wouldn't be long before the rest of the walls succumbed to the ravenous, storm-fueled waters of the sea. "The whole dining room's under now," Walter said, his voice hollow with shock. "The kitchen," Tony said. "The freezer," David added. They all stood and stared. "We should light the lighthouse," Jonathan said, watching Slabhenge fall apart. No one heard him over the wind and the thunder and their own open-mouthed amazement. "We should light the lighthouse," Jonathan shouted, and stricken faces turned toward him. "Why?" "So they know we're here," he answered. "So they send help." He looked into Colin's eyes, then Walter's, then Patrick's. "I want to go home." His voice cracked at the end and got lost in the mad confusion of noise. He said it again from the bottom of his lungs. "I want to go home." "If you light it, they'll know to come," Patrick yelled from behind him. "When they can, anyway. This old thing ain't been fired up since before I was born. They'll notice it for sure, and they'll know to come." Jonathan ran to a large wooden bin that lined one of the walls and threw open the lid with all his strength. Inside, neatly stacked, were rows of split logs, firewood, stowed, dry and safe, by a man who began as a madhouse baby and ended as a forgotten librarian. In between, though, he was a lighthouse keeper. "We need paper," he shouted, turning to face the group. "The school's office is under water by now," Benny yelled back. "What about the Admiral's room?" They all looked at Sebastian. He shook his head. "None in there. He didn't even have a book." Jonathan's mind flashed. "The Admiral's office. It's locked, remember?" Jonathan smiled. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the rusty metal key that'd fallen out of the dead Admiral's jacket. Sebastian's mouth dropped open. "Come on," Jonathan said to him, tossing his piece of sinner's sorrow into the great iron bowl. "The rest of you, get the wood in the fire pit." He took the lantern from Colin, then pulled. Jonathan pulled 99 gently from his shoulder and handed him to Colin. Colin grimaced and held him with 2 hands out away from his body. Jonathan and Sebastian ran back down to the lighthouse stairs. When they got to the old door, Jonathan swore. There was an inch of water running like a river down the stairwell, pouring in from the hallway. The water was even higher than he'd imagined. It was already to the 2nd story. "We've got to hurry," he said to Sebastian. "This whole place is going to fill up and fall down." They bolted down the hall, their feet splashing through the rushing water. At the door of the Admiral's office, Jonathan held up the lantern and stabbed the key into the lock. It clicked into place, then turned. He shouldered the door open, and they ran inside. The water rushed in with them. The office was lost in the shadows, but Jonathan remembered it vividly from the first awful night. The Admiral's sneering voice, his demonic eyebrows, the pain of the sinner's sorrow, the letter full of lies, the Admiral's acidic words as he read Jonathan's paperwork. You have done terrible things, haven't you, Jonathan Grisby? Jonathan walked straight over to the standing file behind the desk where he'd seen the Admiral tuck his folder. He pulled it open. Inside were neatly ordered, identical manila folders, each stuffed with papers. They didn't have to count to know there were 16 files. On the tab of the first folder was scrawled his own name. His eyes scanned the rest, Colin Kerrigan, Sebastian Mortimer, and 13 more. He set the lantern down and grabbed half of the folders. They handed them to Sebastian. He tucked the other half under his arm and picked up the lantern. This should be enough, he said, and they darted back out into the hallway. The water was even higher now. Jonathan winced and dodged a dead rat being washed down the hallway. Another one bobbed by, paws tucked out stiff into the air. At the top of the lighthouse, the other boys and Patrick had half the wood piled in the big metal bowl with the ravenous remains of the sinner's sorrow. They stood waiting on the raised platform around it, looking out at the world gone mad. Jonathan glanced quickly and counted the towers. Another had fallen. Only two still standing, and the lighthouse. Another of the courtyard's walls was mostly gone. Jonathan looked at the name on the file in his hands, Walter Holcomb. He handed the folder to Walter. Reginald Miller, the next one said, and he gave it to Reggie. Sebastian started to do the same. Eventually, Jonathan was left with one folder in his hand. Jonathan Grisby, it said. He opened it, and words from the top page jumped out at him. Guilty. Criminal arson. He ground his teeth together and crumbled the paper into a ball. He stepped forward and shoved it into the waiting pile of wood. He looked at the second sheet. More words swam up through the darkness and lightning. Death. Sophia. Injuries. Grief. Guilt. Tears scalded his eyes. His lungs shivered as they breathed. He wadded the paper into a tight ball as tight as his fist could manage, and he added it to the unlit fire. Around him, other boys started to do the same. Amidst the roar of wind and storm came the sound of a ripping paper, of crumbling files. And all around the circle, fuel was added to the lighthouse fire. Eventually, they all stood, hands clean and empty. Beneath the ready logs was tucked a white mound of twisted paper, a crumbled pile of crimes, a bonfire's worth of guilt and punishment and dark history. Sebastian took a candle from another boy's hand. He leaned forward, but he stopped. The candle's flame inches from his paper. He frowned. He leaned back. He looked at Jonathan. Lightning flickered, showing his flooded eyes. I don't want to go, he said. Jonathan blinked and didn't answer. You want to know why I never wrote letters? Sebastian asked. Because there was no one to send them to. I got no parents. I got no family. I spent my whole life in places like this, or orphanages, group homes, foster homes. He looked out at the storm that was pressed in all around them, screaming and pounding the windows. I don't have anyone to read my letters. No one cares. I got no one to write to. Jonathan swallowed and took a step closer to Sebastian. You can write to me, he said. Sebastian's eyebrows furrowed. His mouth opened, but he didn't say anything. You can write to me, Gerald said. You can write to me, man, Walter called out. You can write to me, Sebastian, Colin said, just loud enough to be heard. Sebastian sniffed. He nodded, looking around, then rubbed his eyes with his sleeve. Light the fire, Jonathan said. Sebastian nodded again, one more small nod, then stretched the candle out and touched it to the nearest paper. Other boys stepped forward then with their candles, holding the flames to the papers closest to themselves. Climbing fingers of flames crept up through the crisscrossed wood. The papers flared and burned into bright flashes of yellow. The boys stepped back and covered their eyes. There was a crackle and a snap as a piece of wood caught fire. A couple of wisping sparks rose up and flickered out. The sound of the fire grew louder. The lighter, brighter, the flames higher, the heat hotter. The boys stepped down the platform and back to the lower floor. The room grew warm. Their soaking clothes steamed in the heat. With a final flurry of crackling, the whole pile caught fire. Flames arced and danced 6 feet high. The room, hemmed in on all sides by the stormy world's fury, grew brighter than daylight. Jonathan stepped into the metal hand crank and muscled it into motion. With a shuddering, squeaking creak, the gears and wheels attached to the mirror sprang to reluctant life. The mirror began to slowly rotate around the towering flames of their signal light fire, magnifying and reflecting the light out into the clouds, the storm, the world. Sebastian joined him at the crank, and they worked together. The mirror moved faster, sending its spear of light out into the darkness. You know, in the book, this is a spear of light going out into the darkness from the lighthouse. After a while, Jonathan let go and stepped back, sweating and gasping. Another boy took his place. He leaned back against a low wall beneath the windows. His arms were burning, the good burning of muscles put to good use. The room was filled with the vital heat of the fire he had built and lit, the fire that would save them all. A good heat, the kind that calms shivers and warms the chill from wet and tired bones. The fire felt good. He closed his eyes and didn't try to stop the tears that seeped out between his eyelids, running in warm paths down his face. They ran down his cheeks and over his lips, which opened to a wide smile, tasting their saltiness. He laughed as the tears poured from his eyes. Colin walked over and stood beside him. The giant rat still sat on his shoulder, sniffing at the smoky air. "Why are you laughing like that?" he asked. Jonathan laughed and sobbed and looked at the beautiful fire through the blur of his tears. "Because I want to go home," he said. "Then why are you crying?" Jonathan didn't wipe at the tears. He let them burn in his eyes until they were full and flooded out. "Because I want to go home," he said. "Because I want to go home." That is it. And there's acknowledgement page at the back. Acknowledgement means you want to let you know. The word "know" is in there. Acknowledgements, people who have made writing a possibility for him. He says, as always, there are far too many people to thank and recognize. I feel so grateful and lucky to be surrounded both professionally and personally by so many people who support, help encourage, and inspire me. My family who cheers me on, my friends who lift me up, keep me grounded, my agent, my amazing editor, whose judgment and wisdom make all stories better, to the wonderful educators I'm so lucky to work with at Mission View Elementary in the Wenatchee School District. There are too many of you to name, but you are an inspiration and a force of incredible good in the world, and I'm blessed to know you. So he thanks educators, friends, people that helped him write the book and support him in it. He says here, this is important for you, future writers or writers of today. To all fellow writers I've been fortunate to meet and connect with over the past couple of years, it's been a thrill to get to know you, and the world is richer for having your stories. Your dedication to storytelling has inspired and strengthened my own. To all good folks at NaNoWriMo, Scar Island began as my first Nano project several years ago, and look at it now. Thanks for supporting writers and writing dreamers and dreaming, and a mad month of marvelous imaginings. It was named Best Book of the Month. He's a teacher, a librarian, and a father of 3 daughters. He lives with his family in Washington State. It says you can visit him at dangemeinhart.com. He has a website. So I thought that was great. I hope you did too. It says the jacket art and design are by Nina Goffey. She designed the front cover, and designed it, and drew it. Sometimes someone else could design it, I guess, and another person could draw it. It says it was designed. The art and design was by Nina Goffey. Okay. That's all, folks. We will. My group that's I'm reading this for is going to be doing some book discussion, etc., to follow. And I hope whoever else is reading this will do that with their classes and maybe with their friends. Suggest it to them if you see a friend who's looking for a book. Remember, oh, you got to read Scott Rowland. It's the best book I ever read. And I've heard about a book called Restart, and I'm going to look into that one. And I've also I've read it before, and I might read it coming up. The book, what's it called? Holes. Holes is the book I may read, or Restart. I'm going to check into those two books. Enjoy reading. Keep it up and listening, and whatever it is you do to get a book into a book, enjoy yourselves. And thank you for listening. And look for me in another book. My name is Beth Rufo, and I read Scar Island. Look for Beth Rufo and other books in the future. Bye-bye.